Blessings, everybody. Welcome to the channel. I hope you're doing well wherever you may find yourselves. Today's episode is one I've been wanting to do for a long time, and I would probably say ever since I started this channel over a year and a half ago. And the reason for wanting to do this video is I'm pretty sure it was on YouTube. It could have been Quora or Reddit, but as I said, I'm pretty sure it was on YouTube. There was some discussion in the comment section about Metallica, and someone posted, and this is not an exact quote, but as close enough to what I can remember. So a semi-quote, if you will, if that's a thing. Quote, "I don't understand how people expect Metallica to sound the same after all these years." So commenting on people, fans like me, who still want Metallica to return to the thrash metal sound that they had on the first 4 albums. So here's my response to that. Well, I'll say this first. Essentially, what this video is about is, should bands or artists adopt with the times? Times change. The most trending or popular type of music has taken over what you were doing. Let's move in that direction. Should bands adopt with the times? Essentially, what I think that involve what I say. Let me try again. What I think when I think of this topic, rather, should a band or artist adopt with the times? I think it's a very slippery slope. On one hand, you want your band or the artist in question that you love so much or you like very much, you want what they put out to be something you enjoy, especially the closer it is to very good, great, amazing, masterpiece, legendary, the better you'll feel, right? Emotionally, you'll be, great. This is the band I know and love doing what they do best. They're sticking with what they're good at and therefore pleasing their fans. Now, having said that, it's a slippery slope because as an artist, you want to not just please your fans, you also want to take pride in your work. You want to please yourself. So you want to be able to satisfy both arenas or theaters, if you will. You want to satisfy yourself as an artist. Just again, there's a certain pride and weight that goes with that, but you also want to satisfy your fans and what they crave, and that's difficult. Now, we know that David Bowie, great video on YouTube, is a short clip, I've talked about this many times, where he says you don't want to play to the gallery. And what he means by that is if you don't experiment, you'll get stale. And so that's part of that slippery slope. But having said that, if you're experimenting for the wrong reasons, like because you want to do pop music because you're more interested in money, that's a problem. But if we take money out of the equation and stick to, should a band adopt to the times, not for financial reasons, but because they want to go with the flow? Well, that's a problem too, because now you're following what the Joneses are doing, or that's the expression from the 70s or 80s, going with the Joneses or going with the flow or just going with the trend. And if you're doing something just to be trendy, then you're not being yourself. Remember Shakespeare, to thine own self be true. But if you're experimenting because that's what you want to do, because it's in link or in sync with your integrity as an artist or as a band, and then it's different. So if we take money out of the equation, and if we talk about not going with the flow because you want to do as the Joneses do, if you take those out, then I get the desire to never grow stale, that kind of thing. So that's very important. This is that slippery slope again, as I say. On one hand, you want your band or artist to keep putting out stuff that's amazing or very good, right? But on the other hand, you don't want them to grow stale. So let me give that quote one more time. I don't understand how people expect Metallica to sound the same. My response to that is Motorhead. Okay, I have other bands I want to talk about, and I'm going to come back to Motorhead in a little bit. But let's share the spotlight with Metallica with their rival Megadeth. Now, except for a little bit of experimentation, you have the album Risk and you have the album Cryptic Writings, which is a bit more commercial than the thrash metal stuff. But Megadeth comes back to the thrash metal or the heavy metal and leaves that Cryptic Writings Risk period behind. There's some pretty good stuff on Cryptic Writings. It's not the thrash metal we know and love. And I have to admit, I do like some of what is on Risk. I don't like the bluegrass song, but other than that, hey, at least you made an attempt to experiment. And if experimenting or going with the flow or adopting to the times fails, then go back to your roots. And I'm a big believer of that. So adopting with the times, or you're adopting with the times because you're afraid you're going to get left behind. That's another thing to talk about. Well, again, if you look at my list, you'll see that there are quite a few bands, and there are others not on the list, who did not adopt with the times, or they did, but they went back to their roots because they realized that was a mistake or an error, and they did just fine overall, big picture wise. So this notion of being left out doesn't happen, or being forgotten doesn't happen with most of these bands, if not all. So let's talk about Megadeth. So Megadeth comes back to their roots with things like Endgame and 13 and Dystopia and other albums, of course. I'm trying to, it's not The System Is Rigged, but anyway, there's an album cover that looks like very similar to Peace Sells Who's Buying. But anyway, The System has failed. That's definitely better than Risk and Cryptic Writings in many ways. So if you look at Megadeth big picture wise, their discography is mostly heavy metal. All right, AC/DC. Now I have an asterisk next to AC/DC because they stick to their guns through and through and don't change sound whatsoever, but they do get a bit stale. However, having said that, do you want AC/DC to sound like a commercial pop band? Ugh, I don't. So they're one of those bands that remaining true definitely would be a good thing just because of the type of band that they are. Opeth. I'm not an Opeth fan whatsoever. I like the guitar work, but that's it. I just can't get past the witch-like vocals, and they've returned to that in the prog stuff that they did. Not a big fan. There's one album that's okay prog-wise. I think it's the one that comes after the album that has the feathers from the peacock on it. It's got like a house in the background. That one's kind of cool. But overall, I'm not a big Opeth fan. So they experiment with the prog and a blues prog album. I think that's the Peacock album cover. But they come back to their roots with their they're going to put out a new album, or they have, and they return to that witch-like vocals. So for the most part, Opeth has remained true to their roots with a little bit of a detour over this way, right, with the prog stuff. Again, answering to, I don't understand how people expect Metallica to sound the same, or if we take Metallica out and put bands to sound the same. Well, High on Fire, Electric Wizard. Now, Swans is an interesting band. They did deviate from the norm. They went from sounding like a heavy, really heavy, hard-hitting Godflesh type band, but not totally Godflesh. And then Michael Hira saying, we got to change our sound because we've done all we can in this genre, if you will, or subgenre. And then the stuff that you find on the most recent album and The Great Annihilator and The Glowing Man, the last 4 or 5 albums really is different from their earlier stuff, and yet it's amazing. Now, they did have a period where there's like 3 or 4 albums I don't care for. They even went out their way to please the fans, and I forget the name of the album. It's purple and has like a yellow lily on it. That's their really commercial effort, and it went over like a lead balloon, of course, because this is an example of how when you try to be uber commercial and your fans aren't buying it, that kind of thing. Of course, some fans will buy it. So Swans. Motorhead, I mentioned. Motorhead, like AC/DC, but a better example than AC/DC, because while there's some stinkers in their catalog, there's 3 or 4 albums by Motorhead I just don't like whatsoever. Like Hammered and Motorizer and The World Is Yours or The World Is Ours, and then the one after Inferno that's got the gray cover, Kiss of Death. Those are the 4 I'm not a big fan of. There's a song or 2 on each one that I like, but overall those 4 albums I can do without, and I could just have the MP3 of the songs on those that I like. So Motorhead sticking to their guns, and you wouldn't want Motorhead to sound like the way Def Leppard sounds right now, right? Okay. Venom, need I say more? Or Venom Incorporated, the spinoff, sounds more like a High on Fire type band than the early Venom stuff. But okay, so Judas Priest, 1 or 2 slip-ups. They had a slip-up with Turbo. They had a slip-up, arguably, with Nostradamus, although it's a heavy metal album. Now, Judas Priest is an anomaly in the sense that they weren't always a heavy metal band, but they were a hard rocking band, at least from the get-go, through and through, till today, and then moving into heavy metal water. So that's what I mean. Talk about Led Zeppelin. Let's face it, In Through the Outdoor is not Led Zeppelin at their best. I do like this album quite a bit, and that's because of Jimmy Page dealing with his addiction issues, and so it took Plant and John Paul Jones to step up. It's really their baby here, and so of course it's going to sound different. But overall, Led Zeppelin is one of those bands that never veered from what they wanted to do. And of course, this is a bit of a paradox, if you will, or ironic, probably a paradox, because straight out of the bat, after the first album, the second, third, especially starting with the third album and the fourth album, they're really venturing in physical graffiti. They're really, doing hard rock, and they're doing blues, and they're, snippets of proto metal. So they're all over, and folk rock, and so they're all over the place to begin with. So maybe that's not the best example, but you get my point. Black Sabbath, there's some slip-ups in the discography, of course. Not many of us. There's there's a lot of us who don't like Technical Ecstasy and or Never Say Die, but at least it was still approaching heavy. There's some jazz and horns and stuff. We get that. It's experimenting. Then you get the Dio, Return to Form, even though it's a different singer. Then you get Iommi wanting to go solo, but the record label says no, you got to put out a Black Sabbath album, it'll sell better, so you get 7 Star. That's very commercial and non-Sabbathy, if you will. Eternal Idol's a little better. Then you get a really return to form with Headless Cross and especially Tear, those two. And then, of course, Forbidden for me is a nightmare. But overall, Black Sabbath staying with their roots for the most part. Manowar, not a big fan of Manowar. I was in high school, but they have that album when they get a bit commercial, where the album cover is an imitation of Kiss's Destroyer, and then they would come back with their heavier stuff, their epic stuff. There's the albums with the faceless muscle guy with the hammer and the sword in both hands, that kind of thing. Celtic Frost, they have like 1.5 slip ups. They have the Nightmare. It's got Cherry Orchid on it. The name of that album eludes me. Then you have Vanity / Nemesis, I think it's called. Those two are questionable because they're not very heavy, although Nemesis is okay. It's the one with the 4 faces like Van Halen on the album cover kind of a thing. And I think the mirrors are kind of cracked. Cold Lake is the one with Cherry Orchid on it, so kind of doing a glam thing. And then they come back to Return to Form with Monotheist, the comeback album. But overall, if you look at Thomas Gabriel Warriors, because he's the genius behind, Hellhammer, Celtic Frost, and Triptychon, for the most part, staying true to form. The Black Crowes, need I say more? They do delve into a lot of Appalachian bluegrass type rock on After the Frost, but overall, that Humble Pie, Stones, Faces kind of feel, right? Lynyrd Skynyrd, talking about the original band, first album through and including Street Survivor, and then you have the Plane Crash, and I've tried to like the stuff after that with, the brother on vocals, just doesn't do much for me. The Beatles did change, but overall, if you look at the discography, essentially what you have is a pop band, similar to Led Zeppelin in the sense that they do venture into different waters, but overall their shtick is pop / rock, right? Heavy songs here and there like Helter Skelter, etc. But overall, psychedelic with Sgt. Pepper's, right? So you get my point. Now, if we talk about some other things here, Well, what I mean by that, if you take Uriah Heep as example, for the most part consistent from very heavy, very humble, through and including, say, High and Mighty, although High and Mighty and Return to Fantasy not as good as the things that came before it. I think Wonderworld, the more I listen to it as I get older, is definitely underrated. And then you get the John Lawton era. But despite the fact that Byron is gone and you have a new singer, so sometimes a new singer will throw change and you can't do anything with it. But that is an excuse for changing or going with the times. Are they really adopting with the times, or are they just trying to get a hold on how do we continue to be Uriah Heep with a new singer who's a bit different? So I think it's more of that latter thing. But you go from Byron to Lawton, Lawton to Sloman, one album with him, then Peter Golby, 3 albums, and then Bernie Shaw with a slew of albums. And Shaw sounds like Byron on the live stuff, not so much with his own the new songs post Golby and before. And so Uriah Heep is an interesting animal with respect to, I don't think you can say Uriah Heep adopted to the times. They never became grunge. They never became, fill in the blank. They stuck to their roots. The changes that came just because of changes in vocalists, and they did their best to stick to their guns, if you will. Now, sometimes going with the times will work, or changing with the times. For instance, Whitesnake going from a blues band to a more hair metal type band, but it's still heavy. There's some wonderful heavy stuff. It's not bluesy per se. It's more hard rock or approaching heavy metal because of Sykes on guitar or Vandenberg or other guitar players that have come and gone, or that added on when they redo an album, right, or revisit it, as Coverdale likes to say. So it works with Whitesnake, although a lot of people in Britain upset when Slide It In came out and they changed from their bluesy to more hair metal-y style with the American version of Slide It In. It works with Pantera. Pantera goes from a glam band with it's either Glaze or Blaze, the last name, and then changing with Phil Anselmo. They have the power metal album, his debut. And then they become different after that with Cowboys from Hell. And from then on, I like power metal, but from then on, that change in signature sound actually works. So they're experimenting, but they're not chasing commercial success, because they went from a glam band, which is more about that commercial success usually, to heavier waters, which can alienate some people, and of course vice versa can be as well. So, for example, a lot of bands who were heavy or hard rocking and become uber commercial alienate moi. So finally, bands that I've had grievances with over the years because of them adopting to the times. Rush comes to mind, being way too influenced by the Police, perhaps chasing money from, who knows, for commercial success, maybe pulling a Ritchie Blackmore. Rainbow comes to mind. We'll get to Rainbow in a minute. I should write that down. That's one I left off my list here. So back to Rush. So you have the band perhaps wanting to sound like the Police to compete with them, because losing to them in the Grammys because of that. So again, it could be Rush goes into Police mode because of jealousy, or wanting to sound like the Police because the Police won a Grammy and beat them. It was something on Ghost in the Machine, something with, it's got Camel in the title, I think. It's an instrumental that goes nowhere. And then Rush is YYZ, and of course Rush loses, even though YYZ is leagues and miles better than I Have the Camel or whatever it's called, a back of it, something like that anyway. So it's years since I've listened to that. So you get Signals and Grace Under Pressure, which are decent. They don't hold, they're not as good as what came before. I like them, but it took me time. But I don't care much for, I've said this before, Power Windows and Hold Your Fire, and some things after that leave much to be desired. Too much bubbly stuff on Roll the Bones. There's a rap song or quasi, So Rush was disappointing. I mentioned Metallica at the beginning of the video, disappointing for so many of us. Once you get to the Black Album or right after the Black Album, many of us jump ship, right? But some of us coming back to check in, see, have you changed back to nope, that kind of thing, right? Genesis doing what Rush did and going from this amazing prog band to commercial banality with songs like Tonight, 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 You're Taking It All Too Hard. There's just so many. Let's see. I posted this, I think, not too recently. Let me pull this up, everybody. Oops. I want to get the song titles right. All right, here we go. Genesis discography. So if we talk about, I'm not a big fan of Duke, Abacab is okay. If we talk about the Genesis self-titled album, which came out in '83, songs like That's All, Illegal Alien, Taking It All Too Hard. Taking It All Too Hard is the song I was thinking of. So that one, Taking It All Too Hard. Then An Invisible Touch. Tonight, 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 In Too Deep, and Throwing It All Away. Those four songs sounds like something that belongs in a beer commercial or a soap opera or a movie soundtrack. It's just way too commercial, not the Genesis I know and love. Def Leppard, once they get into Hysteria, I'm pretty much out. I am out. Again, part of the problem was Pete Willis leaving, and he was the guitar edginess that he brought to the table, right? And then Joe Elliott not wanting to be labeled heavy metal. I've talked about that before. Motley Crue post the first two albums, starting with Theater of Pain. Even he admits, that is Vince Neil, at least in the Dirt movie and in the book, that album is horrible. He admits that to the manager, Doc McGee. King Crimson going into the 80s sounding like the Talking Heads. I've spoke about that before. Rainbow. The first two albums are amazing. The third album is decent or solid. There's some songs in there I don't like, or they're mediocre. And then after Ronnie leaves, pretty much for me, I'm out. And Julia Turner comes in finally, and there's kind of a resurgence. It sounds nothing like Dio, but I do love the Straight Between the Eyes album, even though it's very commercial. Difficult to Cure is not as good as that one, but I do like some of what's on there. You have an homage to Beethoven, right, or Mozart. And then Bent Out of Shape is when I'm out. Now, last couple things I'll say. One thing I want to point out with respect to Rush. We'll go back to Rush for a minute. When I talked about that slippery slope of wanting to please yourself but also please your fans, an album with respect to where Rush does that wonderful job of tightroping and wanting to do what they do, having pride in their work and yet pleasing their fans, is Moving Pictures. That is the pinnacle of how you walk that tightrope of not playing to the gallery, sticking to your integrity, sticking to your roots. It's different from what came before, although Permanent Waves is approaching Moving Picture. So if we talk about Permanent Waves and Moving Picture, much different from what came before because of the debacle of dealing with how hard it was to make Hemispheres, right? We all know that story, or us Rush fans know that story, so we get that. And yet, having said that, these two albums are much different, approaching a little bit more commercialness, and yet it works, and it pleases both the fans and it pleases the band members themselves. Take great pride in these works, the band members did or do, and us fans take great pride in these albums as well. And then once you veer after that, things change. Again, Neil Peart said that Moving Pictures is when we became Rush. I have issues with that. I take issues with that, because if that's the case, why did you veer away from that sound after that? So just throwing that. So Moving Pictures is an example of where not sticking to what you did as a band, and yet it's just as glorious. It's different, but it's just as glorious, and it's heavy at times. It's different, as I said, and it's majestical, and it's their magnum opus, Moving Pictures, that is, for so many of us. So again, adapting with the times. Should you do it? On one hand, if you're going to experiment because you're doing it for the right reasons, not for money, not for following the Joneses, but for the most part, adopting with the times is following the trend. You're being trendy and not being yourself. Most of the time, I think that's the problem. But again, moving pictures is an example where it's not. In fact, you could argue, well, it's not moving with the Joneses at all because you're experimenting. You're not, because nothing sounded like that. So overall, I would argue that adopting with the times is a negative. Overall, I hate it because what could Metallica be had they stuck to their roots? And I know losing Cliff was a big, and then losing Jason again he quit, right? Was a big thing. What could have Rush? What Rush could have been had they not fallen into the police trap, right? What could Genesis have been had they stuck to their roots and not gone commercial and stayed proggy? Trick of the Tail was so wonderful. Peter Gabriel's gone, and yet for that they stuck to their guns and didn't go down the commercial rabbit hole. What Def Leppard could have been instead of the disappointment with the commercial hair metal road they went to, the Bon Jovi-esqueness, right? Same thing with Motley Crue. King Crimson, those 3 albums with Wetton, Bruford, and Fripp are just amazing, and Jamie Cross, right? And Muir, M-U-I-R, I can never pronounce that right, on Lark's Tongues and Aspic. Just an amazing trilogy of albums, them at their peak. But Fripp got bored and wanted to change and sound like the Talking Heads and go with the flow, and for many of us, we're out. And then, of course, Rainbow. I did a separate video on this with Richie, chasing commercial success. So tell me what you think in the comments. Should a band go with the times? I'll say this. If you're a heavy metal band, you wouldn't want to go down the rabbit hole of sounding like Kraftwerk, right? You don't want High on Fire sounding like Kraftwerk. You don't want Electric Wizard sounding like a post-punk new wave band. You don't want Opeth sounding like AC/DC. You don't want Led Zeppelin sounding like ABBA. You don't want the Black Crowes sounding like Ace of Base. I'm a bit playful here, but again, this is just me talking. It's my opinion. Nowhere am I saying you have to agree with me, but I think adopting with the times does more harm than good. Again, to thine own self be true. Look at all the bands that I listed: Motorhead, Venom, Judas Priest, for the most part. Being in Uriah Heep, being in the game for decades, 30, 40, sometimes some of these bands 50 years, and sticking to your roots, and it's paid off dividends, or it's worked well for you, instead of pulling a Def Leppard or a Rush or a Genesis. And here's the last thing I'll say. Why I'm against going with the flow or adopting with the times. As I've said already, you're not being yourself, etc. Again, you want to walk the slippery slope wire act of pleasing yourself and pleasing your fans, and it works in the case of moving pictures. But why you shouldn't go with the flow or change with the times or adapt with the times, we've seen, because you can stick to your guns and you can still be successful. You're not left out. You're not forgotten. Look at all these legacy bands: Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Black Crowes, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Beatles, AC/DC, right? It works. And finally, you want to, I think, not go with the flow, because it is rare indeed where someone can constantly change from signature style to signature style, or go with the trend and it works. Very rare indeed. And what am I thinking of? I'm thinking of David Bowie. And yet we can't even include David Bowie. When he does Let's Dance, it works. He goes into uber commercial waters and it works. And then the album after that, Tonight, not as good. Never Let Me Down, pretty much a horrible album. And then he comes back to his roots. And yet, having said that, his whole discography has some pieces that all connect together, and yet they're pieces that are so different, and yet it works. So David Bowie's an interesting character, an interesting artist, because he's got so many hats, he's got so many faces, he's got so many styles. He's got the blue-eyed soul, he's got the glam, he's got the hard rock, he's got some proto-metal, he's got the pop, he's got the commercial stuff, he's got the artsy stuff with the Berlin Trilogy, he's got the uber commercial period, 4 albums, he's got, you know, a really bad slip up with Black Tie, White Noise, and then you get into the outside going forward where everything is wonderful again, right? So David Bowie doesn't play to the gallery. That's the video I'm talking about that he does about why you want to experiment. But not too many bands can you do that and experiment and still be yourself and hold true to who you are. And focus and hold on to that integrity. It just doesn't happen. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So again, Bowie's an anomaly. He's a riddle, he's a paradox, he's whatever you want to call it, because he doesn't play to the gallery, and rarely does he play to the commercialness and go with the Joneses. A couple albums, maybe three albums, maybe 4, and that's it. So he slips up like everyone, but overall, if you look at his whole discography, take out those 4 albums, you have things that connect. They're changes from album to album. And yet, it works. Rarely does it happen with most bands and artists. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. God bless.